Tonight, we're starting with something everyone can relate to: sleep, or more precisely, the way people in the Middle Ages went about it. And as you'll see, their habits were much stranger than what most of us would expect. So before you settle in, take a second to make sure you're cozy. If you enjoy these kinds of late-night history wanderings, consider subscribing. And if you'd like, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always interesting to see who's listening along from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe put on a small fan just for that steady hum in the background. And let's slowly drift into tonight's story together. Back before electricity, sleep apps, or advice from wellness influencers, medieval people followed a nighttime rhythm that would leave most of us baffled. It was known as segmented sleep, a two-part system that divided the night into halves, almost like splitting a loaf of coarse medieval bread. The process was straightforward. When the sun went down, most people went to bed fairly early. That first stretch of rest was known as first sleep. Then, after about 4 hours, they would wake up, and not by accident. They were supposed to. This middle-of-the-night period lasted anywhere from an hour to 2. During that time, people engaged in all kinds of activities, what we might jokingly call midnight multitasking. And no, this wasn't considered insomnia. This was simply how nights were structured. That break between the two sleeps had its purpose. It was useful, practical, and sometimes surprisingly social. People prayed, they read scripture, they kept fires burning, or checked their animals, because few things interrupt rest like the thought, did someone forget to latch the goat pen? It was also, according to medieval doctors and moral guides, the most favorable time for intimacy. They wrote that the body was refreshed and the mind calmer after the first sleep, which feels like a polite medieval way of saying too tired to argue. So, if you've ever thought waking up early to bring your partner a cup of coffee was romantic, well, your ancestors were setting their bar in a very different place. After this interlude, second sleep would follow, lasting until the morning light. From monks in monasteries to farmers in small villages, nearly everyone lived within this pattern. Even writers like Chaucer mentioned it casually in their works, which tells us that yes, even medieval literature is full of people talking about broken sleep schedules. Strangely enough, modern research has suggested that this two-part cycle may actually be more natural for human biology. When artificial light is removed, our internal rhythms seem to fall back into this very same pattern. So the next time you find yourself awake at 2 in the morning, don't worry. Just think to yourself, the watch has started. And maybe imagine tending a little symbolic fire. It wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, when factories ran late, gas lamps lit the streets, and productivity became a constant demand, that people began insisting on 8 uninterrupted hours of rest, as though sleep itself had turned into a competition sport. For medieval people, though, waking in the middle of the night wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was simply the routine, and everyone, whether they enjoyed it or not, was part of it. Now, let's move from the schedule of sleep to the places people actually slept in. Beds, or at least the medieval attempt at them. Today we argue over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, or whether a mattress is cloud-like. But for most people in medieval Europe, a bed was little more than a pile of materials that once belonged to plants or animals, now flattened into something just barely usable. The standard peasant bed was a straw mattress known as a pallet. This was literally hay or straw stuffed into a sack of coarse cloth. And if you didn't even have a sack, then it was simply a heap of straw on the ground, damp sometimes, and sometimes already claimed by the household cat. Comfortable, not really, but it was still better than having nothing at all. Straw was cheap, easy to find, and it helped keep the cold away. It was also excellent at sheltering fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse, which meant that sleep required a kind of cautious stillness. If you felt an itch, you ignored it. If something bit, you rolled slightly and hoped that would solve the problem. Families with a little more money or stronger backs might lift the mattress onto a wooden frame. That didn't make it luxurious, but it did lower the risk of waking up with insects crawling into your ears. Sheets were a luxury, not an expectation. Most people slept in the clothes they wore all day. Pajamas weren't really a thing, and neither was personal space. Whole households, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents often slept together in the same room, occasionally even on the same straw pile. If the heat built up too much, you simply shifted closer to someone's elbow or knee. For the wealthy, things were different. Noble families slept in large wooden frames with feather mattresses, embroidered linens, and heavy canopies that blocked out drafts and, hopefully, the lice. Beds of this sort were valuable enough that they were passed down in wills. You might not inherit land, but you could inherit Aunt Matilda's well-worn feather bed. Still, for the majority of people, the bed was never a symbol of comfort. It was a place to avoid freezing, to stay away from the chickens, and to quietly hope that one day they might earn enough to sleep on something that didn't rustle, squeak, or peck in the middle of the night. And while we're on the subject of medieval nights, we should talk about the nightcap. Today, when someone says nightcap, we think of a warm drink by the fire maybe, something with a bit of whiskey, followed by a questionable decision or two. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink. It was a literal cap, a fabric hat meant to keep your head from freezing while you slept. Because insulation was not medieval architecture's strong point. Stone walls, drafty thatch, and windows made from thin animal horn or stretched parchment offered little protection from the cold. So people wore hats at night, and these came in all kinds of shapes. The most recognizable design was long and pointed, almost like the hat of a wizard who'd taken up part-time work cleaning chimneys. They were usually made of wool or linen, or whatever scraps of warmth could be spared without upsetting the livestock. For men, it was purely practical. For women, it could double as a coif or head covering. This had the extra benefit of keeping modesty intact, while also concealing hair that hadn't been washed since sometime last Lent. And as simple as they were, these nightcaps carried social meaning as well. In some areas, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, even in bed. Even when drifting off, the nightcap remained on the head, and its look could quietly announce your status. A cap stitched with bright thread or dyed in expensive hues suggested that even in slumber, you belonged to a household of means. In busy towns, the nightcap carried extra symbolism. If you answered a knock on your door wearing one, it politely conveyed, "I'm finished for the evening. Kindly leave me in peace." In other words, this was the medieval version of a do not disturb sign. Most of the time, the cap wasn't alone. It was paired with a nightshirt, a simple, loose garment, long enough to cover most of the body. Think Ebenezer Scrooge's famous sleep attire. minus the moral ghosts. Comfort was the goal, not seduction. The fabric was often scratchy, sometimes flammable, but serviceable. Sleeping beside strangers today is something we associate with a cramped flight, a badly planned camping trip, or an unfortunate hostel booking. In the Middle Ages, however, this was standard practice, and almost unavoidable. Inns were rare and costly, and private space was a luxury. Travelers who managed to find one were assigned not a private bed, but a portion of one. The space was almost always shared with people they had never met before. These inns resembled communal sleeping halls more than modern hotels. If there was an empty spot in a bed, someone would be placed there. A single mattress might hold 2, 3, or 4 occupants, depending on its size and the innkeeper's generosity. In larger towns, a dormitory-style hall was common. Rows of beds in which personal boundaries were non-existent. Snoring, tossing, and the occasional midnight argument over elbow space came with the territory. Sometimes beds were separated by gender, or guests were grouped by trade. A blacksmith might be paired with another blacksmith, a cleric with a fellow cleric. Thieves, ideally, were placed together, though whether they followed the rules is another matter. Often, though, it was simply a matter of whoever arrived first claiming their spot. From the modern perspective, this may sound like an unbearable setup, but compared to sleeping outside, with wild animals, unpredictable weather, and the chance of running into unfriendly locals, it was a step up. Travelers often took precautions against theft by tying purses to their belts, tucking coins under their clothing, or sleeping directly on top of their belongings. Bags served as pillows and alarms at once. If someone shifted your bundle, you woke instantly. The wealthy, of course, avoided these inconveniences. Nobles traveled with servants, pitched tents in comfort, or demanded private quarters from an innkeeper. Refusing such a request could result in the inn losing its roof altogether. Going to bed was not simply a physical act in medieval life. It carried heavy spiritual undertones. Sleep was considered a rehearsal for death, and death could arrive at any time. Thus, people prepared as though each night might be their last. Evening prayers were not optional, they were essential. Confessions, psalms, and carefully memorized verses were whispered before the body was allowed to rest. Unlike today, where people seek calming teas or soothing music, medieval sleepers braced for the worst. Fire, disease, or demons could strike at any hour. Even something as simple as living past 30 was considered unlikely for many. To neglect prayer before sleep was to risk waking up in hell unprepared. The familiar childhood prayer, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," captures the mood perfectly, though gentle in tone. It was essentially a legal clause written for the soul, acknowledging that death could easily arrive between sunset and dawn. Adults often learned entire repertoires of prayers tailored to different threats, one for guilt, one for protection against evil spirits, another for plague. Specific saints were invoked for protection during slumber, acting like celestial guards at the door of your unconscious mind. The deeply religious closed their day with Compline, the final prayer service, after which silence was strictly observed. For monks and nuns, this vow of silence blended naturally with exhaustion. Daily labor left little energy for chatter, and the looming fear of night only added to the quiet. Children, too, were encouraged to pray before bed. It was said to strengthen their souls, though it also kept them occupied when they wondered aloud why the family dog was curled at their feet again. Parents often reminded them that angels watched over them, comforting on the surface, but in practice, more like an eternal surveillance system. In essence, prayer at bedtime was less about relaxation and more about damage control. Think of it as a kind of medieval antivirus software, protection you hoped would work, though few understood its mechanics. Dreams, too, carried immense weight. Today we might laugh them off as nonsense, or blame them on too much cheese. But in the Middle Ages, dreams were viewed as messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, and sometimes from the saints. A dream could warn of danger, hint at sin, or reveal hidden truths. To ignore it was to risk overlooking a divine signal. Entire manuals were written on how to read dreams. Fire in a dream could mean hell. Water might suggest cleansing or drowning. Encountering strange creatures in sleep could be taken as a direct assault from demons. Such visions weren't dismissed as mere fantasy. They were treated with the seriousness of confession, sometimes requiring fasting or penance to counteract their potential meaning. Monks and nuns frequently recorded their dreams and submitted them to spiritual leaders for interpretation. Some became known for visions considered holy, while others were gently encouraged to moderate their diet, particularly their intake of onions, before bedtime. Of course, dreams were never just private mysteries to be puzzled over. They also made for excellent storytelling fuel. Medieval writers loved weaving dreams into their narratives. Entire poems and romances opened with a slumbering knight who suddenly found himself confronted by angels, demons, or strange allegorical beasts reciting cryptic lines about virtue and sin. Dreams filled the same space that modern streaming series do for us. Though instead of happy endings and light-hearted comedies, what you got were moral lessons, heavy symbolism, and plenty of ominous foreshadowing. Naturally, the church was wary of this fascination. Not every dream, they warned, came from God. Some visions, they argued, were planted by darker forces, meant to trip up the unsuspecting soul. If a dream led you to impure thoughts, it might mean your spirit was under siege. Or, of course, it might simply mean you had drifted off too close to the fireplace and inhaled a bit too much smoke during the night. Today, many people happily let a cat or dog curl up beside them under the covers. It's a cozy, if occasionally smelly, habit. In the Middle Ages, though, sharing a bed with an animal was less a matter of personal affection and more a matter of heating technology. Let's begin with the basics. Medieval homes were not designed for warmth. Thick stone walls offered no insulation, and winter winds slipped through cracks and shutters with such persistence. You could almost give each draft its own name. Central heating, as we know it, simply did not exist. Instead, the warmth of a pig or a dog often substituted for a fireplace. In peasant homes, it was entirely normal for people and animals to occupy the same sleeping space. Sometimes that meant the same room, sometimes the same bed, and often just the same straw heap. Chickens wandered about freely, dogs curled up near feet. A pig might snort drowsily beside the hearth. And if fortune was on your side, none of them would nip or scratch you in the middle of the night. But this wasn't simply about love of animals. Of course, medieval folk valued their beasts, but at night, their presence was mainly practical. Animals radiated heat. A large dog could keep your toes from going numb. A cow standing quietly in the corner could lift the room's temperature by a degree or two, which in January might have been the difference between enduring and suffering. For poorer households, especially, life revolved around a single multi-purpose room. Here, people cooked, ate, worked, and slept. Children nestled between their parents, sometimes with a goat or hen tucked nearby. A rooster could double as a living alarm clock, though one prone to ringing at ungodly hours. As for hygiene, best not to ask too many questions. Among the wealthy, conditions looked different, though not entirely. Nobles didn't usually bed down beside barnyard animals. Still, lapdogs frequently shared their master's chambers, less for warmth, more as a mark of refinement. And in some grand castles, favored pets were even provided with their own chambers, because nothing displays status quite like a hound with its own quarters. Of course, sleeping with animals had its inconveniences. They were noisy, prone to moving about, and not especially mindful of personal boundaries. But medieval families adapted. A hoof in the ribs at 3 in the morning was just another feature of the household routine. If this seems crowded, consider what awaited in the monastic world. Anyone who has ever stayed in a noisy youth hostel might think they know discomfort, but medieval monasteries set an entirely different standard. Their dormitories were vast halls lined with rows of narrow beds, dozens of monks packed side by side like disciplined sardines, silent and still under the weight of obedience. Beds, in this case, often meant nothing more than bare wooden planks. A straw mattress was considered generous, sometimes only granted on special occasions. You slept fully dressed, not for modesty's sake, but because rising for prayers at 2 in the morning was far easier if you never undressed. Monastic robes, belts, and sandals doubled as both nightly clothing and spiritual armor, though they offered little insulation. Pillows were not provided. Curtains for privacy were non-existent, and speaking at night was strictly forbidden. Under the rule of Saint Benedict, silence was a virtue. A monk who groaned too loudly while shifting might well be punished with extra chores. Snoring, meanwhile, was tolerated reluctantly, not exactly a sin, but hardly welcomed. Lighting in these dormitories was minimal. Perhaps a single candle flickered somewhere in the vast, dark hall. You didn't need to see. You needed only to lie still, remain quiet, and keep your thoughts from wandering toward temptation. To the monks, this austerity wasn't cruelty, it was training. Every denial of comfort was seen as preparation for eternal life, a rehearsal for the journey of the soul. Sleep, like food and work, was part of a strict spiritual timetable. For some, even lying flat was too indulgent. Certain monks chose to rest sitting upright, both to discourage dreams and to avoid even the faintest taste of luxury. Compared to this, the peasants' straw heaps and pig companions could almost seem decadent. After all, at least the pig didn't judge you. Now picture the routine that might horrify a modern sleeper. Rising deliberately at 2 in the morning, not for the bathroom, not to glance at a glowing screen, but to shuffle into the chill and pray. This was the monastic life. The schedule of monks and nuns was structured around fixed hours of devotion. The first of these was matins, a service that fell not at sunrise, but in the very depths of night, when even owls were reluctant to stir. The call to worship came with the tolling of a bell, rung by whichever unlucky soul was assigned the task. Slowly, the dormitory emptied of its drowsy inhabitants. Cloaked in their robes, still fully dressed, the monks moved in silence toward the chapel. Pajamas were unknown. The only layering they recognized was spiritual, not physical. Inside, beneath the heavy arches and faint candlelight, the monks recited psalms and scriptures. Their voices echoed softly in the stone chamber. Many struggled to stay awake, swaying slightly on their feet, fighting the very human urge to drift back into dreams. It was a discipline of body and spirit alike, and often an exhausting one. There are accounts of monks being disciplined for nodding off during prayers. The penalty was usually more chores, or ironically, even more prayers. If you drifted off during matins, congratulations, you might be chosen to lead the next one. Matins alone could stretch on for an hour, sometimes two if the order was especially zealous. Picture trying to stay spiritually focused while your stomach reminds you that supper was just a bowl of lentils. Your mind is foggy and your eyelids are leaden. Once the service ended, monks either returned to bed for their second sleep or, in stricter monasteries, went directly into study or manual work. Few things demonstrate devotion like threshing grain on 4 hours of broken sleep. Why so early? The reasoning was that by sacrificing rest, one could dedicate the quietest hours of the night to God, free from the distractions of daylight, warmth, or dreams. It was meant as a powerful expression of faith, though it came at the cost of numb toes, smoky air, and the dubious joy of Brother Ambrose's tone-deaf chanting. Today, sleeping alone is often described as peaceful, a sign of independence, luxury, or at least a way to keep the blankets to yourself. In the medieval world, however, sleeping alone was suspicious, impractical, and sometimes downright unsafe. First, the basics. Warmth. As we've already seen, beds weren't cozy. Stone walls and drafty chimneys let in the cold, and central heating was centuries away. So people shared beds, not because they wanted intimacy, but because body heat was the cheapest heater available. Children bunked with siblings, parents, and even visiting neighbors' kids. It was like a medieval sleepover, except no one asked if you wanted to join. But there was more to it than comfort. People believed the night was the devil's favorite working hours. Alone in the dark, one's soul was thought to be vulnerable to temptation, or worse, possession. Having others nearby acted like a kind of spiritual shield. If something sinister happened, at least someone else would notice, or be targeted first. For children especially, solitude at night was unthinkable. Ghosts, fairies, and wandering spirits were considered part of the nighttime world. Stories warned that sleeping alone could invite mischief or danger, and these tales didn't end with hugs and moral lessons. They ended with venom. Even married couples rarely had a bed to themselves. Children, servants, or unexpected guests often shared the mattress. Privacy, as we know it, was less a reality and more a modern invention. In fact, the idea of two people occupying a big bed alone would have seemed bizarre, a waste of space at best, or suspicious at worst. Even in monasteries, monks usually slept in communal quarters. If someone was made to sleep alone, it was often a punishment. In that context, solitary sleep wasn't a privilege. It was discipline. The reasoning was simple. Being alone made sin easier. Group sleep meant accountability. So next time you tuck yourself into your quiet, private bed, enjoy it. In the Middle Ages, you'd likely be surrounded by children, a sheepdog, and a cousin or two, all snoring in unison. If you've ever nodded off in a classroom chair, or while waiting for a dentist, you know the stiff neck and regret that follows. But in medieval Europe, sleeping upright wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Some people, particularly the wealthy or deeply religious, chose to sleep propped up instead of lying flat. Why? Several reasons, none of which sound restful. First, medicine. There was a belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, the lungs, or the body's humors. In an age when physicians thought sneezing might disturb your soul, this explanation made sense. Sleeping upright, they believed, reduced the risk of brain congestion, an ominous phrase that really meant don't choke on your own phlegm. Then there was the spiritual reasoning. Lying flat looked too much like the posture of the dead. You didn't want to risk confusing God, or worse, catching the attention of the angel of death. Superstitious, certainly. But when your priest also doubled as your doctor, you chose carefully which advice to ignore. Because of this, people often slept partially upright, with big pillows, bolsters, or headboards acting like makeshift recliners. The wealthy even had beds adjusted to tilt at an angle, making it easier to digest their evening pie or repel demons. Monks went even further. In strict orders, they might sleep sitting on benches or leaning against stone walls with only their hood for support. The point wasn't health, it was discipline. If you were too comfortable, you might dream. If you dreamed, you might sin. And if you sinned, confession awaited at sunrise. Clearly, this wasn't about rest. It was about endurance, discomfort, and questionable theology. But even the most virtuous monk couldn't escape the true enemies of the night. Not ghosts, not demons, but bugs, tiny, relentless, and very much alive. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were the medieval bedroom's constant companions. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't medieval Europe's strong suit. Baths were rare, laundry was costly, and soap was sometimes made from substances you'd rather not think about. Add to that straw mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional chicken wandering through, and you had the perfect pest paradise. Fleas and lice were so common they were practically housemates. Peasants faced them daily, but nobles weren't spared either. In fact, wealthy families sometimes had a special servant whose job was to pick lice from their master's hair and clothes. Imagine introducing yourself as the royal nitpicker. And then, of course, there were bedbugs. By night, the tiny but relentless killers of sleep crept from their hiding places. They lurked in wooden bed frames, in the seams of straw mattresses, and even in the cracks of stone walls, waiting until darkness to feed like miniature vampires. If you've ever wondered why people in the Middle Ages wore caps to bed and often slept fully clothed, warmth wasn't always the reason. Sometimes those layers acted as a form of pest-proof armor. The strategies to keep the bugs away ranged from mildly practical to wildly bizarre. Some households filled their rooms with the smoke of herbs like wormwood or tansy, believing the sharp scent would drive the insects off. Others went to sleep surrounded by garlic, onions, or even ashes tucked into the bedding. That may not have done much for the fleas, but it certainly discouraged romance. It wasn't just the itching and biting that disturbed rest. Fleas carried symbolic weight. They were sometimes viewed as a mark of sin or impurity, a crawling reminder of humanity's fallen state and of poor hygiene. Writers of the time even turned them into subjects of verse. Some poems condemned them, while others, strangely enough, turned the flea into a symbol of love. Let us be united like the flea that bites us both, one poet suggested. Proof that medieval courtship could take some questionable turns. So while our modern nights are often broken by glowing phone screens or the rumble of traffic, medieval slumber was far more likely ruined by scratching, twitching, and the unpleasant sensation of something crawling along your leg. And often, it really was. We've all had restless nights, but have you ever tried to fall asleep while wearing 100 pounds of metal? In the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that. Nothing says sweet dreams like lying down ready to joust. To be clear, most people, even knights, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It was blisteringly hot, crushingly heavy, and impossibly noisy. Rolling over in chainmail was about as restful as trying to nap inside a cutlery drawer. But in times of war, or when sleeping in dangerous territory, soldiers often chose partial armor over comfort. Survival mattered more than rest. A knight on campaign might strip only his helmet and gauntlets, leaving his mail shirt or breastplate in place, just in case enemies attempted a raid in the middle of the night. There's nothing quite like waking to the sound of hooves outside camp and having to strap on gear while still half dreaming of turnips. In a besieged castle, men-at-arms sometimes slept with swords or axes within reach, like particularly sharp security blankets. Shields doubled as pillows. If the enemy broke through the walls, at least you wouldn't have to waste time getting dressed. Of course, sleeping in armor wasn't exactly restorative. Metal doesn't breathe, and chainmail had an irritating tendency to pinch the skin. Add in cold stone floors, thin bedding, and the constant racket of snoring companions and crackling torches, and the experience fell somewhere below modern airport lounges on the comfort scale. Even civilians weren't entirely free of this habit. Travelers moving through dangerous regions, merchants, guards, or caravan escorts, sometimes dozed in padded garments like gambesons. These quilted jackets offered a measure of safety, plus a little more softness than the mere comfort of prayer. And one more thing, armor was anything but discreet. Shift the wrong way, and the clatter of metal might be so loud that everyone else assumed the world was ending. Now, in an age where demons prowled, lice thrived, and pigs in your bed were not unusual, you might think that sleepwalking would barely register as a problem. But in the medieval mind, it was a very serious matter. If you wandered in your sleep, people didn't shrug it off as stress or overtness. They saw possession, witchcraft, or even unfinished spiritual business. The sight of someone rising from a straw pallet, shuffling blank-eyed across the room, and muttering at a wall looked less like a sleep disorder and more like a rehearsal for demonic activity. Records from the time suggest real fear of sleepwalkers. Imagine a man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, reciting Latin he didn't actually know while stepping over livestock. Would you think harmless? No, you'd think ghost or heretic. And depending on the local priest, the next morning might involve an exorcism. Some writers claimed the cause was bad humors, especially an excess of black bile, the usual diagnosis when nothing else made sense. Others argued that the soul temporarily left the body during sleep, leaving the empty shell to stumble about like an untethered mule. Families tried different ways to stop it. Herbal tonics, whispered prayers, iron charms hung over the bed, or, in more rural areas, simply tying the sleeper's leg to a chair. Harsh, perhaps, but safer than letting someone drift toward an open hearth, a kitchen knife, or a waiting chamber pot. Rumors even circulated of sleepwalkers clambering onto rooftops, though it's unclear how many of those stories were true. The idea of dreamers leaping from heights was frightening enough to justify barred windows, and even to spark theological debates about whether sins committed while unconscious counted. Most episodes, thankfully, were less dramatic, simple pacing, mumbling, or fumbling with doors that weren't there. But if someone wandered into a church mid-sleep, villagers sometimes took it as a sign from God, and cleansing rituals were carried out just in case. Medieval life, more than anything, trained people to sleep through chaos. Church bells clanged, storms crashed, livestock screamed, and occasionally a siege raged outside. To those weary souls, it was all just part of the background, the medieval version of white noise. Church bells structured every holy moment of the medieval day. They rang at dawn, for prayers, for meals, and yes, even for the unearthly hours of matins, often at 2 or 3 in the morning. If you happened to live near a monastery, your nights were punctuated by that ceaseless tolling. Over time, the mind adjusted. The sound of bells wove itself into nightly dreams, almost like a lullaby for lives governed by relentless routine. And bells were only part of it. Storms were frequent and frightening. Without forecasts or insulated windows, each thunderclap felt apocalyptic. Roofs leaked, shutters rattled, and chimneys shrieked like restless spirits. Yet somehow, people still managed to sleep. Work didn't pause for sleeplessness. Fields still needed plowing, prayers still had to be said, and raiders weren't about to wait for you to be well rested. Even invasions or catastrophes didn't always stop people from lying down at night. In the 14th century, people endured hunger, war, and even plague, and still found ways to rest. When carts of bodies rolled by in the morning, it was treated less as a panic and more as a grim sort of alarm clock. If you didn't wake at all, many believed it was simply God's mercy. There are even accounts of people sleeping through earthquakes, barn fires, and even rioting crowds. Fatigue was constant, and the human body adapted. If you spent every waking hour toiling from sunrise to sunset, eating only enough to survive, weighed down by mud, taxes, and fears of damnation, you would collapse into sleep no matter the noise. Others used sleep almost like a refuge. Faced with sickness, grief, or yet another prediction that the end of the world was imminent, as happened nearly every century, many simply pulled a cloak over themselves, whispered a prayer, and drifted into unconsciousness. There's a quiet kind of wisdom in that surrender. By the winter of 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, was blanketed not only in snow but in unease. Tension hung in the air, settling into timber homes and frozen fields. The Puritans of Salem were strict, devout, and profoundly superstitious. They believed they were forging a holy community in the wilderness, watched by God above, but stalked by Satan below. Life was already a trial. The settlement had split from Salem town in disputes over politics and faith. Harvests had failed. Outbreaks of smallpox had devastated nearby villages, and brutal wars with native tribes had left deep scars. Quarrels over property, rivalries between families, and distrust of outsiders only worsened the sense of unease. Add to this the long, punishing New England winter, and cracks were inevitable. Those cracks first appeared in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of the village. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began behaving in ways that alarmed everyone. They shrieked uncontrollably, hurled objects across the room, and twisted their bodies into unnatural postures. Sometimes they sat rigid and silent, eyes wide with fear. Neighbors murmured of curses. The girls insisted they were pinched and bitten by unseen hands. Reverend Paris, at a loss, called for the village doctor, William Griggs. Unable to find any physical cause, Griggs uttered the word that would ignite hysteria: witchcraft. That single diagnosis poured fuel onto the community's already simmering fears. To the Puritans, witches were real servants of the devil, bent on corrupting God's people. And if such evil could creep into the minister's own home, what did that mean for the rest of Salem? Soon, under pressure and encouragement from adults, the afflicted girls began naming names. At first, they pointed to women living on the fringes, outcasts, beggars, and misfits. But the accusations would not stop there. They would soon reach into the ranks of the respected, the wealthy, and even the pious. Salem was only a small settlement, but what was about to unfold would echo through history. What began as murmurs in the night would end in cries from the gallows. Once the suspicion of witchcraft took hold, it spread relentlessly, like ivy creeping over a wall. The afflicted girls, Betty, Abigail, and soon others, like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis, grew bolder. They collapsed in spasms during trials, screamed during prayers, and claimed to see spectral shapes hovering above their neighbors. These weren't private imaginings. They were dramatic, public, and most dangerously, they were believed. The first women accused were those with little defense. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar who muttered to herself after being turned away at doorsteps. Villagers insisted her ramblings were curses. She smoked a pipe, snapped at children, and simply didn't conform to the expectations of a godly woman, making her an easy target. Sarah Osborne had fallen out of favor by skipping church for over a year and scandalizing her neighbors by marrying her servant after her husband died. Her defiance of convention alone made her suspicious. And then there was Tituba, an enslaved woman in Reverend Paris's household. Brought from Barbados, her accent, folk tales, and unfamiliar customs unsettled the villagers. Under harsh questioning, possibly even beatings, Tituba confessed to witchcraft, but her confession only worsened matters. She spoke of a tall man in black who urged her to sign his book. She described yellow birds, red cats, and spectral hounds. Most chilling of all, she insisted that there were other witches in Salem. That was enough to open the floodgates. After that, names were added constantly. Old grudges were repackaged as accusations. Property disputes morphed into claims of demonic attacks. If a cow died suddenly, it was the work of witches. If a child cried during a sermon, surely the devil was present. Fear spread so completely that even the innocent were too frightened to speak in defense of the accused. An accused which quickly learned that even defending oneself could make matters worse. In Salem, silence was often the safest response, and yet even that was dangerous. Each refusal to speak, each hesitant word, seemed to spark fresh suspicion. The web of accusations grew wider, invisible and sticky, catching almost anyone who came too close. Logic was slipping away. What filled its place was a tide of hysteria, swelling larger each day. By the time panic reached its peak, colonial authorities felt compelled to intervene. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and eager to restore order, authorized the creation of a special tribunal. It bore a grand title, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French phrase meaning to hear and determine. In practice, however, the court became something far more unsettling, a machine that turned fear into verdicts. When proceedings opened in Salem town in June of 1692, they did not resemble ordinary trials. Rules bent and broke under the pressure of collective panic. The court permitted a peculiar kind of testimony, spectral evidence. This meant that if someone claimed your ghostly form had harmed them in a dream or a vision, it could be presented as proof against you. Whether you were present in church or working miles away did not matter. If someone said your spirit had pinched, choked, or tormented them, that was enough. Dreams could not be cross-examined, and no one could prove what another person had or had not imagined. The girls at the center of the storm became star performers. Their shrieks, convulsions, and dramatic collapses filled the courtroom day after day. Mary Walcott, one of the afflicted, was known to throw herself into fits the moment a supposed witch entered the chamber. If a prisoner dared to look her way, she screamed. If they avoided her gaze, she screamed louder still. Each display was more theatrical than the last, and the judges, including the respected Samuel Sewell and Chief Justice William Stoughton, treated every gesture as genuine. There were no defense lawyers in Massachusetts at the time. Colonial courts provided none. The accused stood alone, shackled before their neighbors, fighting charges that twisted no matter how they answered. To deny guilt was to provoke the girls' agonies. To confess, even falsely, might earn a reprieve, but only if one supplied the names of others. The system rewarded falsehoods and punished silence. Crowds gathered from nearby villages to watch. Trials became public theater, with the accused marched into court, bewildered, exhausted, and often destitute. And yet beneath the noise, some whispered doubts lingered. A few townspeople suspected the girls were pretending. Others questioned why certain families seemed especially targeted. But to raise such concerns aloud was to risk being accused yourself. In Salem, to question the court was to question God. Fear had become the highest authority. On June 10, 1692, the gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She was an obvious, target-outspoken owner of a tavern, and remembered for wearing brightly colored clothing that set her apart. She had been accused of witchcraft before, years earlier. At trial, neighbors swore her spirit had pinched them, that infants sickened after she passed, and that she kept strange dolls. Bridget denied all of it, but denial carried no weight. The court declared her guilty. She was taken to Gallows Hill, a barren slope beyond Salem, where the rope ended her life. With that act, the machinery of execution began to turn. More followed. On July 19th, 5 women were hanged together: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some were respected within their churches. Rebecca Nurse's death shocked many. She was elderly, devout, and well-loved. At first, a jury declared her not guilty. Yet, under pressure from magistrates and from the ever-dramatic afflicted girls, the verdict was reversed. As she went to the scaffold, she declared softly, "I am as innocent as the child unborn." Her words drifted away unheard by justice. The noose, indifferent, tightened all the same. The pace of executions quickened. August claimed more lives, and on September 22nd, the bloodiest morning arrived. 8 were hanged in a single day. Among them was Martha Corey, who had questioned the trials from the beginning. Her husband, Giles Corey, endured an even harsher fate. Refusing to enter a plea, he prevented the court from proceeding with a trial. In response, officials turned to an ancient English punishment, peine forte et dure, pressing with stones. For 3 days, weights were piled on his chest until he could no longer breathe. His last words, remembered as legend, were more weight. By the time the frenzy burned itself out, 19 had been executed by hanging. Giles Corey had been pressed to death. At least 5 more perished in jail. Over 200 were accused, and countless others confessed falsely in hopes of survival. Salem's gallows cast shadows longer than the scaffold itself. Shadows that touched every household, every family, every whispered conversation. Meanwhile, scores of prisoners languished in jail. The small Salem lockup could not contain them all, so accused witches were scattered across neighboring towns, Ipswich, Boston, and others. They were chained in dank cells, left to starve or freeze, their conditions foul beyond measure. And most of these people were no witches at all. They were farmers, mothers, children, neighbors who had lived ordinary lives. Their real crimes were trivial quarrels, unpaid debts, or owning land others coveted. Accusations often hid petty grudges. A pig died after wandering into a garden. Witchcraft. A man refused to lend firewood. Surely a curse. Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, knew this well. She was a pious mother of 7, respected in the community. At first, she was released by the court. She was arrested once more, only a few days later, after the afflicted girls suffered new fits. That second arrest sealed her fate. In her last petition to the judges, Mary pleaded not for her own life, but that they put an end to these proceedings before more innocent blood was spilled. Not long after, she was executed by hanging. Another tragic case was that of Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was interrogated. Terrified and confused, she gave halting, nonsensical answers that were twisted into a confession of witchcraft. Her words, little more than frightened babbling, were treated as evidence. She spent 8 months chained in prison. When she was at last released, her mind was broken, and she never recovered from the ordeal. Even pregnancy did not guarantee safety. Elizabeth Proctor, the wife of John Proctor, who himself would later hang, was convicted and sentenced to die. Because she was expecting a child, her execution was postponed. That delay spared her life. She gave birth behind bars and was eventually freed once the trials came to an end. The accusations spread like wildfire. Some of the accused, desperate to survive, confessed to witchcraft to avoid execution. Many then named others, shifting suspicion away from themselves. Whole families were swept into the frenzy. Fathers, wives, children. No one was beyond suspicion. Meanwhile, the jails grew overcrowded. Food was scarce. Disease spread, and some died awaiting trial, lost in a system driven by panic. Every week brought new names. In Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only whether someone was willing to point a finger at you. By the autumn of 1692, the frenzy began to weaken, not because the courts suddenly came to reason, but because reality could no longer be ignored. The turning point came when accusations grew too bold. Those who had once cheered the trials found themselves accused in turn. One such case was Reverend George Burroughs, a former Salem minister. He was charged with leading the supposed witch coven. Though educated and well-spoken, he had clashed with powerful families in the past, enough to make him a target. On the day of his hanging, Burroughs did something no one expected. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly and without hesitation, something it was believed a witch could never do. The crowd fell silent. Some cried. Even hardened witnesses were shaken. But still, the execution went forward. That moment planted the first seed of doubt. Then came an accusation against Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps. The hysteria had now reached the very top of the colony's social order. Governor Phipps, already rattled by growing criticism and disorder, finally acted. In October 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer, halting all remaining executions and trials. Public opinion had begun to shift. Clergy who had once stayed silent or even supported the trials now spoke against them. Increase Mather, one of the most respected theologians of the colony, condemned the reliance on spectral evidence. It is better, he declared, that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was a shocking reversal in a society that had, for months, believed the opposite. The crowds who had once demanded blood now began to question the trials. Though the prisons were still full, the hunger for more executions was fading. Too many respected figures had been accused. Too many innocents had been buried. The people of Salem were beginning to see that this was not divine justice, but chaos. Confessions slowed. Some accusers retracted their claims. Others slipped quietly out of public view. The loudest voices now fell silent. The fear remained, but the frenzy had burned itself out. The village wanted peace again. Officials wanted to salvage their reputations, and Salem, wounded, shamed, and exhausted, was finally ready to awaken from its nightmare. The storm was ending, but the destruction remained. By late 1692, the legal system that had fueled the hysteria was collapsing under its own weight, with the court of Oyer and Terminer disbanded. A new tribunal was established in early 1693, the Superior Court of Judicature. This time, rules had changed. Spectral evidence was no longer admitted. The judges themselves were far more skeptical of the accuser's claim. The result was immediate. Convictions slowed dramatically. Most accused witches were now acquitted. Of the 56 cases presented before the new court, the majority were released. Even those who had confessed began retracting their statements, admitting that fear, torture, or pressure had forced them to lie. The dramatic fits and cries of the afflicted girls lost their power to convince. One particularly telling case was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister suddenly suspected of witchcraft, though he was never formally charged. The idea that such a high-ranking clergyman could be suspected revealed how absurd the trials had become. The one zealous court grew cautious. Prisoners were slowly released, first those with little evidence against them, and eventually even those who had confessed under duress. Meanwhile, families of the condemned began demanding justice. The children of John Proctor petitioned for the return of his property. The relatives of Rebecca Nurse worked tirelessly to clear her name. Community shame replaced community terror. Church congregations fractured, friendships dissolved. Salem's social fabric had been torn apart. Governor Phipps, aware of the colony's growing humiliation abroad, finally pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. Yet even freedom came with a price. Many families had to pay their jail fees before release. Imagine losing your home, your health, nearly your life only, to be handed a bill for the privilege of surviving. When it was over, 19 people had been hanged. One man had been pressed to death. 5 had died in jail, and more than 200 had been accused. The court did not merely fail, it imploded, leaving behind a legacy of grief, guilt, and disbelief. The trials were over, but the healing had barely begun. Salem was left permanently scarred by the lives it had taken, the justice it had forsaken, and the reflection it now had to face in the mirror. The gallows now stood silent. The cells were empty, but peace had not returned to Salem. The town was not haunted by spirits, but by the heavy weight of guilt. What had begun with a few unwell girls had spiraled into a collective act of devastation. Families had been shattered, names destroyed, and innocent lives extinguished. Now, those who remained were left to live among the ruins. Neighbors who once worshipped side by side could no longer meet each other's gaze. The same men and women who had prayed together had also testified against one another. Some of the girls who had first cried out for deliverance slipped away quietly from the village. Others faded into obscurity. A few, like in Putnam Jr., would one day admit to regret. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and confessed her part in the frenzy, claiming she had been led astray by Satan. Yet for many, apologies could not undo the loss. Even the officials of the court carried their shame. Judge Samuel Sewell, one of the central figures of the trials, was among the rare few who acknowledged fault. In 1697, during a church service, he rose to his feet while a minister read aloud his prayer for forgiveness. It was a remarkable public act of repentance in an age when most simply wished to bury the past. But burying the memory proved impossible. The families of the condemned pressed for restitution. Year after year, petitions reached the colonial government, requests for pardons, for land to be restored, for their relatives' innocence to be formally recognized. Gradually, Massachusetts responded. In 1711, a bill was passed that cleared the names of some victims and provided limited compensation to their heirs. Yet the reparations were incomplete. Certain families, like the Coreys and the Proctors, were excluded. Though whispers of witchcraft lingered across New England, in Salem the shame became part of the town's identity. The community eventually renamed itself Danvers, perhaps in an effort to step away from its grim reputation. The site of Gallows Hill was never formally marked, as though officials hoped to conceal not just the bodies, but the memory of what had unfolded there. Still, the story endured, in sermons, in whispered recollections, and in the tense silence between former friends. The truth was clear. Salem had never been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, and by unchecked power. And that curse lingered long after the last execution. More than 3 centuries have passed since the trials ended, yet their legacy remains, not only in school books and tourist sites, but in the way we understand justice, fear, and the fragility of truth itself. What unfolded in 1692 was not merely an odd case of hysteria. It was the collapse of reason, compassion, and the rule of law under the weight of panic. Ordinary people, farmers, midwives, ministers, were turned into executioners simply by believing too quickly and questioning too little. The courts that should have protected the innocent instead became engines of persecution. Religion was turned into a weapon. Testimony became theater, and silence itself was treated as proof of guilt. What makes Salem's tragedy so haunting is how swiftly it overtook the town. In only a few months, fear triumphed over fact. Old rivalries, disguised as spiritual battles, became death sentences. It did not require real demons, only belief in them. And yet, from the devastation came lessons. Lessons that would echo across American history. The trials were cited again and again in debates over due process and civil rights. Nearly a century later, the framers of the U.S. Constitution explicitly outlawed practices like bills of attainder and ex post facto laws, instruments that had, in essence, doomed Salem's accused. The right to legal counsel, the right to confront one's accusers, and the demand for evidence rooted in fact rather than fear. These principles were shaped, in part, by the shadow of Gallows Hill. In modern times, the term witch hunt is used casually as shorthand for political persecution or moral panic. But the phrase masks the real terror behind those words. For in Salem, it was not a metaphor. It was a reality in which men and women were hanged for crimes that existed only in imagination, betrayed by the very systems that should have defended them. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: fear, when given legitimacy, becomes its own tyranny. When fear is upheld by courts, endorsed by churches, or sanctioned by governments, it becomes nearly unstoppable. The Salem witch trials remain a warning, not merely of one village's descent into suspicion, but of how swiftly reason falters when fear is granted authority. The gallows have disappeared. The courtrooms stand silent, yet the caution remains. Truth is delicate. Justice is not automatic. And history has a way of repeating itself if memory fades. A new story began. Fulvia entered the world around 83 BCE, born into the old but unconventional Fulvi family. Though theirs was not among the ancient patrician houses, the Fulvi had still climbed into the ranks of Rome's elite. They had produced generals, consuls, and orators, a lineage of ambition tinged with disruption. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was remembered less for political achievement and more for his faltering speech. His nickname, Bambalio, literally mocked his stammer. But Fulvia inherited none of that hesitation. She came into life with presence, born not to stumble, but to command. From childhood, she would have absorbed the sharp edges of Roman politics. Senators debated in her household, alliances shifted with each election, rumors and betrayals filled daily conversation. She would have seen that politics was not confined to the forum. It was played out in marriages, in funerals, in whispers exchanged in corridors. Women of her rank were expected to embody quiet dignity, well-educated, graceful, but obedient. Fulvia would break every one of those expectations. She was wealthy, highly educated, well-connected, and fully aware of her power. Though her early years are faint in the historical record, her later actions reveal her nature. Keenly observant, politically astute, and unwilling to be ignored. She was no background figure. Her personality was forceful, her judgment sharp, her will unyielding. Even in the male-dominated sphere of Roman politics, she carved space for herself. The era itself was one of chaos. The Republic was fracturing. Civil wars erupted, populist uprisings flared, and generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar turned Rome into a battlefield of ambition. Old traditions crumbled, and Fulvia grew to maturity amid the turmoil. Rather than shrink from disorder, she learned to wield it. Her life did not follow the path of a modest Roman matron. Instead, it forged a woman who saw politics not as a forbidden male domain, but as a theater of war to be mastered. She would go on to wed 3 influential men, each of them central to Rome's turbulent history. Yet Fulvia was not content to merely attach herself to power. She would wield it herself. She would one day command troops, stir uprisings, and become the first Roman woman to appear on coins, not disguised as a goddess, but represented as herself. Rome may not have been prepared for Fulvia, but Fulvia was absolutely prepared for Rome. Her first marriage bound her to Publius Clodius Pulcher, and it was far from ordinary. Clodius was no typical Roman aristocrat. He thrived as a populist agitator, a firebrand with a taste for scandal, chaos, and control of the streets. To the traditional elite, he was reckless and threatening. To the common people, he was a champion. And for Fulvia, he was an opening, a strategic alliance. Their marriage in the early 50s BCE tied Fulvia to a man who treated the Roman Republic as though it were his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for flouting custom. He once went so far as to dress as a woman to infiltrate a sacred, female-only religious rite held in Caesar's house, a scandalous act that, astonishingly, only boosted his fame. Later, he abandoned his patrician standing to become tribune of the plebs, an office that allowed him to veto Senate decrees. He grasped the rhythm of Rome's street politics better than nearly anyone, and Fulvia was not a passive partner. Sources suggest she immersed herself in her husband's political world, appearing beside him, speaking with his supporters, and running their home as a gathering place for his movement. Together, they were a new vision of Roman power, daring, populist, and unapologetically confrontational. But the partnership carried a heavy cost. In 52 BCE, Clodius was killed on the Appian Way by the guards of his rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death sent shock through the city. Fulvia did not retreat into quiet grief. Instead, she orchestrated one of Rome's most unforgettable funerals. She displayed Claudius's battered body in the Forum, his wounds exposed for all to see. The crowd recoiled in horror, then erupted in fury. Riots tore through the city. The Senate house itself was set ablaze. Fulvia had transformed private loss into a public uprising. It was her first great political act. She revealed an ability to turn grief into spectacle, and spectacle into power. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia had stepped forward, and Rome could never again see her as just a wife. She did not remain in mourning. In Rome, political capital expired quickly, and she understood that better than most. Soon after Claudius's violent death, she married again. This time, her husband was Gaius Scribonius Curio, an ambitious figure and one of Julius Caesar's staunchest allies. On the surface, Curio might have seemed a curious choice. He was flamboyant, fond of performance, and never far from scandal. Yet beneath the dramatics lay a shrewd political mind. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BCE, he carried immense influence in one of Rome's most fragile years, a time when the Republic teetered between peace and civil war, between Caesar and the Senate. Fulvia recognized the value in Curio. He was not merely a husband, but a connection to Caesar's rising power. This was not a rebound. It was a calculated partnership. Through Curio, she remained tied to the populist movement her first husband had built, while also securing Caesar's favor. She helped reorganize Claudius's old supporters under Curio's banner, ensuring the masses stayed engaged in politics. But the Republic unraveled quickly. Tensions between Caesar and Pompey erupted into civil war. Curio took Caesar's side with full devotion. Fulvia, as always, involved herself managing resources, shoring up support, and keeping political allies close. But in 49 BCE, Curio's military expedition to Africa collapsed. Ambushed by King Juba of Numidia, he was slain and his troops destroyed. Once more, Fulvia was widowed, and once more, Rome watched to see whether she would fade. She did not. Instead, Curio's death hardened her reputation. She had now lost 2 husbands in Rome's endless conflicts, both populist champions. Her most daring alliance was yet to come. But Fulvia herself was still standing. Her third marriage, and the one for which she is most remembered, was to Mark Antony. Antony, Caesar's loyal general and ambitious lieutenant, bound himself to Fulvia around 47 BCE. It was no mere romance, it was a consolidation of power. Fulvia had proven her mastery of street politics. Antony, surging in military and political rank, needed that sort of ally in Rome. Together, they were one of the most formidable pairings of the late Republic. By this time, Fulvia was seasoned. She had buried 2 husbands, faced enemies head-on, and shaped political battles. Antony, for his part, was notorious for his indulgences, drinking, gambling, and scandal. But with Fulvia, he gained more than a companion. He gained someone who could guard his interests, steady his alliances, and stir his supporters while he was away. And Antony, brash though he was, understood her worth. He entrusted her with unprecedented authority. She opened his letters, issued orders in his name, sat in political meetings, and influenced appointments. Roman historians, often hostile, painted her as domineering and power-hungry. What unsettled them most was not her ambition, but her audacity to behave like a Roman man in public life, something the culture had no vocabulary for. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, the Republic collapsed again into turmoil. Antony rushed to secure his claim as Caesar's heir. But it was Fulvia who anchored Rome in his absence. While Antony forged the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus, Fulvia managed the capital. She maintained networks of patronage, dealt with street gangs, and kept Antony's supporters mobilized. She even brokered Antony's reconciliation with Octavian by marrying her daughter, Clodia, to him, an alliance destined to fracture in dramatic fashion. Fulvia was not merely Antony's spouse, she functioned as his stand-in. Roman mints even struck coins that carried Antony's likeness alongside her name, a startling recognition of her authority. She wasn't tucked away in the background of politics. She operated under its brightest light. Yet in Rome, authority was always conditional, and Fulvia was about to discover just how far a woman could push before the city snapped back. While Antony marched across provinces, chasing campaigns and alliances, Fulvia took command of the capital. She did not act as a passive partner, but as his surrogate ruler in all but title. In a climate where intimidation, bribes, and raw patronage upheld order, she demonstrated that she could play Rome's ruthless game as capably as, if not better than, the men of the Senate. The years following Caesar's assassination turned the city into a battlefield, fought with influence rather than blades. Fulvia recognized this and shored up Antony's power by acting in his place at the very center of Roman politics. She directed supporters, managed the urban crowd, bargained with rival factions, and most boldly fought with money and rhetoric. She paid loyal troops, secured peace through bribes, and guided legislation so it tilted toward Antony's advantage. Ancient writers hostile to her, among them Appian and Dio Cassius, often painted Fulvia as quarrelsome, grasping, even warmongering. But underneath their biases lies a striking fact. She was a woman fully engaged in politics, a role Rome had no template for. She built coalitions, funded generals, and even issued edicts, duties normally held by senators and consuls. She appeared before the public, nurtured ties with veteran soldiers, and cemented Antony's image as a commander who rewarded loyalty. When Antony was away in the east, it was Fulvia who kept his presence alive in Italy. She consulted with centurions, influenced distributions of land, and reminded soldiers that their allegiance to Antony was not only honorable but profitable. But this extraordinary reach made her enemies, Rome's elite, particularly those loyal to Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's increasingly bitter rival, bristled at Fulvia's sway. To them, she was an intrusive woman who meddled in soldiers, statutes, and state affairs. Her independence from male guardianship was not just troubling, it was unheard of. Fulvia was not blind to the dangers. She saw the widening rift between Octavian and Antony. She grasped a truth the two men had yet to accept. Rome could not contain both of them. And so she shifted her stance, away from compromise and toward confrontation. By 41 BCE, Fulvia took the unimaginable step. She launched a war against Octavian himself, the man who would later be known as Augustus, and she did so without Antony by her side. While Antony remained in the east, Fulvia joined forces with his younger brother, Lucius Antonius, then consul, to challenge Octavian's hold over Italy. The justification: to defend Antony's claims and protect the veterans who had followed him. But beneath the rhetoric, Fulvia's hand was visible at every turn. This was not merely politics, it was open rebellion, and it was driven by a Roman woman. In fact, it remains the sole instance in Roman history where a woman directly instigated and orchestrated civil war. The conflict, remembered as the Puricene War, arose from Octavian's land policies, which dispossessed Italians to settle his veterans. Fulvia seized on the outrage, branding Octavian as a tyrant and betrayer of Caesar's legacy. With Lucius serving as her figurehead in the Senate, she organized from behind the scenes. Together they mustered 8 legions and took control of Perusia, today's Perugia. This was Fulvia's war. Ancient accounts even imply she was more committed to it than Lucius himself. She encouraged soldiers, stirred public unrest, and communicated with generals. Rome teemed with whispers of her issuing commands and pressing Lucius into unwanted battles. Octavian, though startled, wasted no time. He marched on Perusia and encircled it through the harsh winter of 40 BCE. Supplies dwindled, morale cracked, and betrayal spread within. Fulvia, trapped in the siege, saw her audacious gamble collapse. By early 40 BCE, the city fell. Lucius Antonius was spared, a concession likely intended to avoid irreparably damaging Antony's standing. But Fulvia was not so fortunate. She was branded too dangerous for Rome and sent into exile. Once a woman who had commanded riots, commanded soldiers, and even influenced laws, she was now banished. Her destination was Sicyon in Greece, where she hoped Antony would meet her. But Antony did not rush to her side. The bond between them, forged in ambition and sustained through shared battles, had frayed in absence and mistrust. She had acted in his name, but perhaps without his approval. She had crossed a boundary no woman had before. She had led a civil war. Rome had punished her for it. In exile, Fulvia entered a political limbo. the place where failed contenders drifted when fortune abandoned them. She had not fought for personal wealth or vanity. She believed she was safeguarding Antony's authority, his honor, and their vision of Rome. But instead of gratitude, she was met with silence. Fulvia had gambled everything: her position, her alliances, her survival. And yet Antony did not come. By the time she reached Greece, Antony was already in Cleopatra's orbit. Whether their romance had begun or was still unfolding, the symbolism was devastating. While Fulvia had been mustering armies, Antony was reclining at feasts beside Egypt's queen. The betrayal cut deep, not only as a wife, but as a partner in power. She had waged war to protect his foothold in Italy, and he had left her abandoned. Ancient sources like Plutarch even hint that Antony's anger was aimed not at Octavian, but at Fulvia herself, for daring to launch the Perusian War without his sanction. Some have suggested that Antony may not have mourned her fall at all. Her absence, after all, opened the door to an alliance through marriage with Octavian, an arrangement Fulvia would never have allowed. Yet, even as her strength faded, she wasn't without loyalists. A portion of Antony's soldiers, deeply devoted to her, pressed for reconciliation, but the years of siege, displacement, and betrayal had taken their toll. In 40 BCE, in the city of Sicyon, Fulvia's health gave way, whether to illness, exhaustion, or simply a broken spirit. She was gone. She was only about 43. Her death gave Antony the exit he desperately needed. Soon after, he met with Octavian and sealed peace by wedding Octavian's sister, Octavia. The triumvirs, for the moment, stood together once again, but only because the one woman bold enough to challenge them was no longer in their way. In the decades that followed, Cleopatra's legend would eclipse Fulvia's. Yet it was Fulvia who had set the mold. She wasn't content to whisper from behind a veil. She stepped directly into the storm. She commanded soldiers, shaped policy, and refused to be hidden. Rome did not know what to do with such a figure, and so Rome chose to erase her. But the traces of her rebellion remained, lingering like embers, waiting to be noticed. After her death, those who survived her ambitions, Antonine, Octavian, and even old allies, quietly reshaped her memory. She was gone and could not protest, so her enemies were free to frame the story. Like countless powerful women before and after, Fulvia became a convenient scapegoat. The surviving texts, nearly all written by men with something to gain, cast her as the root of discord. Ancient chroniclers like Cassius, Dio, and Plutarch painted her as jealous, domineering, consumed by an unhealthy hunger for influence. They pinned the Perusian War on her. They accused her of forcing Lucius Antonius into conflict, of stoking resentment with Octavian, even of driving Antony away from Rome itself. But how fair were these portrayals? Not very. The political climate of late Republican Rome thrived on violence, scheming, and force, at least when men played the game. Compared with Caesar's ambition, Pompey's aggression, or the ruthless cunning Octavian himself would display, Fulvia was no more extreme. Her only true divergence was gender. She behaved like a Roman man in a world that only allowed her to be a Roman wife. She refused to be cloistered, spinning wool in the household shadows. She wrote to generals, stirred the urban crowds, and inspired loyalty from hardened troops. That made her threatening, not just to Octavian, but to the narrative Rome preferred to tell. Even Antony, whose reputation she had fought to preserve, found it convenient to lay blame at her feet once she was gone. Her death gave him a clean slate. He reconciled with Octavian, married into his household, and allowed Fulvia's memory to be treated as a stain erased for political survival. No great monuments bore her name. No funeral oration resounded in the Senate chamber. Rome let her pass in silence. But silence cannot entirely erase a life. She had done too much, shaken too many foundations. She had gathered armies, directed elections, forged alliances, and fought a civil war. She was the first Roman woman whose likeness appeared on coinage, not as a goddess or allegory, but as a political actor in her own right. The destruction of her reputation was calculated, etched into the record despite attempts to bury it. If we listen carefully, through the voices of men who resented her, her defiance is still there. Her life closed in quiet, but her legacy was anything but still. Generations after her death, historians strained to make sense of her place in Rome's story. Fulvia unsettled the narrative because she defied every expectation. She did not whisper behind a curtain. She wielded power directly, and in doing so, she became unforgettable. In a society where women were meant to shape events through marriage or soft persuasion, Fulvia chose the sword and the mob. She was not a consort, she was a commander. And though Roman historians chose to remember her more for her disruption than her skill, the outline of her true achievements remains, if we read carefully. She minted coins in her own name. She organized political networks. She maneuvered marriages like pieces on a board. She mastered the urban crowds and played the game of Roman politics with astonishing effectiveness. She was no passive observer of Rome's civil wars. She was a combatant, and her presence terrified men in the Senate, men who preferred women silent. Her end was not born of failure but of circumstance and of the gendered world that judged her. Had she been male, she might have been hailed as another Caesar, or perhaps a gentler Cato instead. She was dismissed as a meddler who dared too much, yet her influence lingered. Later figures, Livia, Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra would all carve paths of power in their own ways. But Fulvia was the precedent. She showed that a woman could shape armies, politics, and succession even without an imperial crown. In recent years, historians have looked back with clearer eyes. No longer cast solely as a cautionary tale, she is being reclaimed as one of Rome's most politically active women. She did not merely exist in the age of the triumvirs. She challenged them, and though Rome tried to erase her, her presence still presents through the cracks of the record. She was not a footnote, she was a force. Back in the early 1940s, civil rights leaders had first threatened a massive demonstration in Washington to pressure President Franklin D. Roosevelt into desegregating the defense industry. That march never took place because Roosevelt, under mounting pressure, signed an executive order to prevent it. Fast forward to 1963, and the stakes had grown far greater. Philip Randolph, joined by Bayard Rustin, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and other key voices, resurrected the dream. This time, the march wasn't just about jobs. It was about dignity, voting rights, school integration, fair wages, and above all, the fundamental right to live free from fear. A dozen major civil rights groups, despite internal rivalries and frequent clashes over tactics, set aside their differences. They recognized the power of standing together. The clock was ticking. Buses were booked. Flyers moved through neighborhoods. Churches spread the word. And across the nation, Black communities prepared for what would become a defining moment in American history. One step at a time, the vision of the march came alive. But staging any protest in Washington was complex. Organizing one that could draw over 100,000 people, perhaps more, seemed almost impossible. The logistics were staggering. Food, water, sound equipment, restrooms, transportation, medical care, security, permits, and yet, against all odds, they managed to bring it together. At the very heart of this effort stood Bayard Rustin, though often kept in the background because of prejudice against his sexuality. Rustin was unmatched as a tactician. He had studied Gandhian nonviolence directly with Indian activists. He had marched, been arrested, beaten, and monitored by the FBI. Nothing deterred him. For Rustin, the march was an opportunity to demonstrate how disciplined, nonviolent action, organized with near military precision, could move an entire nation. In a mere 8 weeks, Rustin and his team transformed an idea into a concrete plan. They called it the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, deliberately framing it to encompass both racial equality and economic justice. This wasn't accidental. While Dr. King would become the moral voice of the day, Randolph and Rustin ensured that the platform addressed not only civil rights, but also unemployment, minimum wage, and labor protections. Still, tension lingered. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors were anxious. They feared disorder, possible violence, even bloodshed. Civil rights leaders promised a peaceful demonstration, but precautions were still taken. The National Guard was on standby. Hospitals in the capital prepared for emergencies. Liquor sales were banned. Federal employees were told they could remain home. Unity was another test. The Big Six civil rights organizations rarely agreed on methods. Younger members of SNCC grew restless with King's patient nonviolence. Others pushed for negotiation and diplomacy. Yet on this march, they all understood the time for silence had ended. Rustin's blueprint resembled a military manual. Every bus and train was registered. Every speech was timed. Marshals were trained to guide crowds and maintain calm. This wasn't just a protest. It was a demonstration carefully crafted to jolt the conscience of America. August 28, 1963. A blistering Wednesday morning in Washington. By 9 a.m., the sun beat down, heavy with summer humidity. Still, the heat didn't deter them. They came from everywhere, north and south, east and west, black and white, young and old. Students, union members, clergy, teachers, domestic workers, entertainers. Some dressed in Sunday clothes. Others carried hand-painted signs. They came by bus, by train, in car caravans, even on foot. In the end, more than 250,000 people converged on the National Mall, a wave of determination and hope. And yet, remarkably, there was no chaos. Despite the government's fear of violence, the crowd was orderly. Volunteers guided marchers. The Red Cross passed out water. Groups sang freedom songs, clapped hands, and welcomed newcomers. Near the reflecting pool, choirs lifted gospel hymns that drifted into the summer air. From the Lincoln Memorial steps came chants of jobs and freedom. Well-known figures mingled among the crowds: Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But no one was chasing celebrities. Everyone was there for something larger, to give their voices to justice. To stand on the National Mall that day was, for many African Americans, an act of quiet defiance. It meant being visible. It meant being counted. It meant declaring, before Lincoln's statue, "We are here." It felt like history itself coming full circle. a century after emancipation. At noon sharp, the program opened. Leaders approached the microphone, one by one. They spoke with different accents, from different traditions, but their message was united. Equal wages, desegregated schools, fair housing, protection from police violence. Mahalia Jackson sang with soul-shaking power. Marian Anderson, once excluded from Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang freely to a vast sea of people. As the hours moved on, the anticipation only grew, not from tension, but from expectation. Everyone was waiting for one man to speak. When he did, the world would stop to listen. By late afternoon, the voices quieted. In the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. approached the podium. His suit was dark, his tie precise, his face calm but full of fire. In his hands, he carried a prepared text shaped with his aides the night before. But the words destined for history were not the ones on paper. He began steadily, naming the pain of segregation, police brutality, and unfulfilled promises. A century after the Emancipation Proclamation, he declared, "The Negro is still not free." His delivery was like a sermon, weaving repetition, cadence, and pauses with masterful control. The audience stood transfixed, some nodding in deep agreement, some dabbing at damp eyes, while others lifted handmade signs that read only one word, "Now." Yet, what unfolded next shifted not just the energy of that day, but perhaps the course of the civil rights struggle itself. Behind King stood gospel icon Mahalia Jackson, who had performed earlier in the program. Overcome with emotion, she suddenly called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And so, King abandoned his prepared notes. He gripped the podium tightly and began to speak from memory, not with rehearsed precision, but with conviction that filled the air. "I have a dream," he began, and the vast sea of people leaned forward. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and truly live out the meaning of its creed." His voice grew stronger with each phrase, clearer with each repetition. "I have a dream that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will sit together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will live in a country where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." By then, it wasn't simply a speech. It had become a vision, a prayer spoken aloud, a lightning strike across history. When King finally concluded with the words, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty we are free at last," the crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, and shouts echoed down the mall. The people knew they had witnessed something beyond rhetoric. They had heard a prophecy. The March on Washington carried weight, not only because of the speeches or the songs, but because of the people. The sheer number of men, women, and children who gathered that day was staggering. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, and countless towns in between. Some were veteran activists who had protested many times before. Others were first-timers who had never left their small hometowns until that summer. Families packed food in shoeboxes, boarded buses for day-long journeys, and arrived still dressed in the clothes they wore to church. Ordinary workers, housekeepers, teachers, factory hands, and postal clerks filled the crowd. They did not see themselves as leaders of history, but as living proof that change was possible. They were the movement. Children were there too. Girls with ribbons tied in their braids, boys carrying cardboard signs made with crayons. Loudspeakers carried voices across the crowd, so even those standing far back could hear. To them, this gathering wasn't simply a protest. It felt like the dawn of a new world. Certain figures stood out that day. Among them was a young John Lewis, only 23 years old, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That senior organizers asked him to soften its language only moments before he stepped on stage. He reluctantly agreed, but even the revised version shook the crowd. Then there was Daisy Bates, the sole woman to address the gathering. She didn't speak for herself, but instead read a statement on behalf of other women activists. The absence of more female voices had already drawn criticism, and her short but powerful remarks highlighted a painful reality. Even in a movement for equality, women still struggled to be fully heard. All around them stood union leaders, priests, rabbis, nuns, and students from diverse backgrounds. Not everyone agreed on strategy. Some followed King's nonviolent path. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's more militant stance. But for that day, those divisions faded. Unity prevailed. The scene was a living portrait of possibility. Black and white hands clasped in solidarity. Freedom now buttons pinned on shirts, and 250,000 people breathing in rhythm as one. They weren't just watching history unfold, they were shaping it. None of them would ever forget it. Yet behind the inspiring images shown to the world, the march was far from simple. What appeared as seamless unity was, in reality, held together by fragile compromises and relentless effort. Bayard Rustin, the chief organizer, faced constant battles. He wasn't only juggling logistics, buses, permits, sounds. Rustin's openness about his sexuality and his past ties to communism made him a target. Some leaders feared his identity would be used to attack the movement. Years earlier, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell had even threatened to publicly accuse Rustin and King of being lovers unless King distanced himself from Rustin's leadership. That threat lingered like a shadow during every stage of planning. Then came the issue of women's representation. Despite enormous contributions from figures like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to deliver major speeches. Rosa Parks herself was honored in the crowd, revered by all, but denied the microphone. The image of unity masked the truth. The movement still carried its own hierarchies and blind spots. Tensions also simmered among the Big Six organizations. Younger SNCC members grew increasingly impatient with the older leaders' gradualism. They wanted bold, immediate confrontation with systemic racism. Core organizers shared similar frustrations. Yet for the sake of presenting unity on that single day, differences were set aside. Meanwhile, the federal government watched nervously. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had assigned more than 100 agents to spy on the march. They tapped phones, followed leaders, and filled dossiers with surveillance notes. The Bureau expected chaos, convinced communists would infiltrate or violence would erupt. When the demonstration remained peaceful, Hoover only doubled down on his obsession, especially with Dr. King. Finances posed another obstacle. The march's cost exceeded $250,000, several million in today's terms. Much of it was covered by labor unions and sympathetic donors, but the organizers scrambled constantly. Equipment was borrowed, including walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. What the world saw as flawless execution was, in truth, the product of last-minute scrambling and human grit. As the afternoon waned, the sun dipped low behind the Washington Monument. Slowly, the enormous crowd began to thin. People embraced one another, sang freedom songs, and lingered, reluctant to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the day had ended. The speeches had been spoken. The signs waved high. The cameras rolled. Now the air was thick with a haunting question. What comes next? In the immediate aftermath, media coverage was mixed. National newspapers recognized the scale of the moment, but often with cool detachment. Many praised the event as orderly and dignified, coded language, meaning it had not turned violent. Few outlets paid much attention to the march's specific demands, such as a federal jobs guarantee or a higher minimum wage, the equivalent of nearly 20. The one thing every outlet covered, however, was Dr. King's dream. That, at least, could not be ignored. At the White House, President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the march, watched the broadcast with unexpected admiration. He called it impressive and quickly met with civil rights leaders afterward. But even so, his civil rights bill remained stalled in Congress, blocked by Southern lawmakers, 4 activists who had hoped for swift policy change. It was a sobering reminder that speeches alone could not dismantle entrenched power. Within weeks, tragedy struck. On September 15, 1963, 4 young black girls were murdered in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been proclaimed, but the nightmare had not lifted, and yet something had shifted. The March on Washington showed the world that mass protest could be both disciplined and powerful, impossible to dismiss. It expanded the coalition of the movement, bringing together unions, clergy, celebrities, students, and everyday workers. Above all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a vision spoken into history, one that would echo across generations and across the globe. The march was over, but the journey was only beginning. That path would soon wind through conflict, legislation, and transformation. The March on Washington did not simply stir America's conscience. It reshaped its moral landscape. What began as a bold act of protest became a cornerstone of the civil rights movement's legacy, permanently altering how this nation understood justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. In legislative terms, the march did not yield instant results, but it created momentum. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. It outlawed segregation in public spaces and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The following year, the Voting Rights Act struck at the very heart of Jim Crow. Would these bills have passed without the march? Perhaps. But would they have carried the same moral weight, the same undeniable public pressure? Almost certainly not. For Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that day lifted him into a new realm. He moved from respected leader to global icon, yet fame carried its cost: surveillance, threats, and ultimately assassination in 1968. The dream he voiced on those steps would become at once more poignant, more tragic, and more revered with every passing year. For the broader movement, the march proved what unity could achieve. It provided a blueprint for mass mobilization and inspired a generation of activists, anti-apartheid organizers in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and human rights leaders around the globe. All drew lessons from that summer in Washington. And its legacy is not frozen in the past. The language of the march, the call for jobs and freedom, the image of peaceful resistance, the echo of "I have a dream," still pulses through modern protests. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter rallies, the reverberations of 1963 can still be heard in every chant and seen in every cardboard sign raised to the sky. Today, King's Memorial stands across the tidal basin from Lincoln's. Visitors walk past his towering likeness, his words etched into stone. But the truest memorial is not carved in granite. It lives in classrooms and voting booths, in marches and voices refusing silence, because the dream was never meant to rest in history books. It was meant to be lived. And the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. More than 60 years have passed since 250,000 people gathered beneath the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington is immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. King's speech is taught in schools, his voice carried forward like a sacred refrain in the nation's memory. And yet, the question lingers. Has the dream been realized or only delayed? In many ways, progress is undeniable. The legal foundation of segregation was dismantled. Voting rights, though under renewed assault in many states, were secured through blood, marches, and court battles. Black lawmakers, judges, mayors, and even a two-term president reshaped American politics. Interracial marriage, once outlawed, is now protected by federal law. These victories are real, and they were carved out by relentless struggle. But the original demands of the march, often overshadowed by King's words, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage remains unmet. Racial disparities in housing, education, employment, and healthcare persist. Police brutality, a driving force behind the earliest organizing, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of true economic justice, of a nation where opportunity is not determined by skin color or zip code, remains unfulfilled. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have taken up the mantle, often drawing on the very imagery and rhetoric of 1963. They marched through the same streets, chant in the same cities, and demand the same rights. But they do so in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be a conclusion. It was a declaration, a line in the sand that said, "This is who we are. This is what we demand." And so, the dream remains, battered, challenged, reinterpreted, but still alive. Whether it is deferred, distorted, or finally fulfilled will depend not on the past, but on us, on the injustices we confront, the courage we summon, and the choices we make. Because the march was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a promise we are still called to keep. And so, the dream continues, unfinished, but alive in every step we take toward justice. Good night, and may you rest peacefully with hope for a brighter tomorrow.